Well, joining us now for more from Washington is Bradley Bowman, Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. But first, let's go to New York City and our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim. And Mike, I hate to say those words, mission accomplished, but President Biden is going to be speaking, we expect, just in a couple of hours. What can we expect to hear from him? And is there anything that he could say to lessen the political damage this entire episode has cost him?
Mission accomplished is not going to be coming out of Joe Biden's mouth. This will be a very reflective speech, I think, more so the last 20 years of the sacrifice that American troops have made, that the families of service members have made, also the sacrifices of American allies. I think this will be encompassing more than just the last 2 weeks, and it needs to encompass more than the last 2 weeks because Biden certainly doesn't want to focus on that. But when he does, and he inevitably will, I think this speech will be more of a defense of what's transpired. The Biden administration will continue what some have called almost a gaslighting by defending the withdrawal itself rather than the circumstances of the withdrawal. There are, while opinion is still split, I think Biden is in the camp, or most Americans are in Biden's camp when it comes to withdrawing from Afghanistan, period. Obviously, the way this was hastily done, the fact that there are still Americans in Afghanistan, the fact that Afghan allies, critical Afghan allies, did not get out is more the point of contention rather than the withdrawal itself. But I think Biden will try to stick to the stronger points of his defense in this speech today. But in terms of the domestic political implications, look, he's at his lowest point right now by far in terms of polling, and he's got battles ahead of him. COVID is raging once again here in America. He's facing internal dissent within the Democratic Party for some of his domestic agenda items in terms of infrastructure. Needs to get people on board very quickly. Congress will be coming back from their recess after the holidays. Kids are returning to school again with the issues with COVID. Parents may need to stay home with their kids at some point if there's an outbreak once again. Dealing with a lot of internal strife right now, both within the halls of Congress and domestically for that nature. So Biden is trying to move past Afghanistan as quickly as possible. Whether the nation will let him move past Afghanistan remains a point of contention, but Biden and his spokespeople will try to do everything they can to kind of try to put a bow tie on Afghanistan as quickly as possible, move on to other agenda items which may be more favorable to Biden. I don't think this is going to affect him in the next presidential election, which is an eternity plus away. But listen, the midterms are right around the corner. The campaign has already started. The margins for the Democrats in the House and the Senate are so razor thin right now that if there is carryover from the Afghanistan issue into next year, it could certainly hurt Biden's chances of retaining the House and or the Senate. He wants to move past it.
Right. It certainly, though, is going to be a talking point for Republicans in the midterms and even in the next presidential election. Bradley, let me just ask you, we heard in the report by our correspondent, Owen Alterman, there's good reasons, logical reasons for the Taliban, at least in the short term, to keep some of the promises they've made about free passage, about not being as harsh as they were in their initial rule of the country. But that conflicts with their ideology. What do you expect to see in Afghanistan, at least in the coming weeks and months?
Thanks for the question, the opportunity to join you. The Taliban has never kept their word, so I don't know why they would start now. They committed in Part 2, paragraphs 2 and 3 of their agreement with the Trump administration from February of 2020 to break with al-Qaeda. And of course, they didn't do that. Worse than that, they actually coordinated with al-Qaeda in their most recent offensive campaign, specifically using members of al-Qaeda in the north to help conquer some of the provinces and provincial capitals in the north. And by the way, your viewers should not miss that we saw Dr. Ayman al-Haq, the former head of security for Osama bin Laden and Tora Bora, return in broad daylight to Nangarhar, flashing a thumbs up and a smirk. So, America and our allies and people of goodwill around the world need to understand that we now have a Taliban al-Qaeda safe haven in Afghanistan, just as we did on September 11, 2001. So I'm less concerned about the politics. I'm less concerned about who's up and who's down in the polls. You want to know why the polls are against keeping troops in withdrawal? It's because there's been a bipartisan failure of leaders in Washington to explain our persistent interests and the threats of those interests and what's necessary to protect ourselves. That's why we're at this point. And, a lot of people are trying to cover their ending endless war tracks by blaming how the withdrawal is conducted rather than the withdrawal itself. And I think if we're really going to avoid similar mistakes in Iraq and Syria, we need to understand that this result was highly predicted and was preventable. And we're here now because Biden and also Trump pursued a timeline-based conditions ignoring withdrawal from Afghanistan, period.
Right. Now, earlier this month, Brad, you tweeted that this catastrophe will not be contained within Afghanistan, which you just talked about. How much of a threat are these terror groups that we've seen emerge there, like ISIS-K? And beyond that, how much of a global impact will what's developed in Afghanistan have be reflected in the coming years?
If you read what Osama bin Laden wrote in 1997 and the years and months leading up to the horrific 9/11 attacks where 3,000 of our citizens were murdered, he was citing things like Vietnam, Somalia, Aden, Beirut, to put forward the idea that if you kill Americans, they run. And so if he were alive today, then he would be adding Afghanistan to that list. Jihadists around the world are saying we defeated the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, now we've defeated America. You have thousands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K and other terrorists that were in prison a few weeks ago now that are released. They're going to supercharge the 20 or so foreign designated terrorist organizations in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. They're going to go around the world. Lone wolves will be motivated to conduct attacks, just as we saw at the heyday of the ISIS caliphate. This is an absolute national security disaster, not just in Afghanistan, but around the world. And we're going to spend years cleaning it up. And America has to start by assuring our allies that we're more reliable than we've been acting like lately, and convincing our adversaries that they cannot commit aggression against us and make us run.
Right. Well, I want to go to Mike on that question about the U.S. reassuring its allies, because one has to wonder, for example, in this region, in the Mideast, how allies are going to react to seeing how the U.S. handled itself in Afghanistan, and wondering, again, about commitments when dealing with, for example, other Islamist forces that we see in this region.
Well, you know, speaking to our guest point just a moment ago, I think some of that will be answered in the coming months when the U.S. Ends its military mission in Iraq. It's not the same. There's not a parallel to Afghanistan. But the question will be, will the lessons be learned? Will it be an orderly withdrawal? Will there be better planning? We're seeing those types of things go on in other countries. We saw Trump withdrew troops from Somalia. There's been sort of a backlash there with limited military strikes from America to help the cause there. I don't think Afghanistan will define whether American allies trust Joe Biden. I think, I think the coming months and maybe the next year or so will tell more of the story, and whether this was just a one-off and this signifies a larger, more dramatic withdrawal militarily, diplomatically, in terms of energy from the Middle East, or if this indeed was a standalone situation in which America has been in one location for 20 years. It's essentially made, we saw little progress because of the way the Afghan army just collapsed within a matter of a couple of weeks, trillions of dollars that got absolutely nothing for America. And if it's a standalone issue that really doesn't impact America's relations with the rest of the world, I think, and I hate to say it because it sounds cliche, but it is true in this situation, I think time is going to tell more about whether this was a one-off or whether it really is a signal of Biden's intentions in the coming years. Israel certainly would have to look at this with trepidation. I think that's the only way they can look at it, especially in the context of the Iranian situation. You have one day where the Kabul airport is attacked and American service members are being blown up, and the very next day, Joe Biden is telling Naftali Bennett in the Oval Office about America's, ironclad security cooperation with Israel that will never fade, that will never go away. Those two things, there's a paradox there. There's at least people wondering. And so, I think in the coming months, especially that Iraq withdrawal, I think we'll see a little bit more whether the Biden administration is going to stick to its word, and whether, again, the important thing, did it learn lessons from an absolute catastrophe over the last few weeks?
I want to give Brad, we have about another 30 seconds, Brad, to pick up on Mike's comments.
I think the Biden administration has a real problem in matching deeds and words. It literally, as the Taliban was about to take Kabul, Secretary Blinken was on the phone to Ashraf Ghani, I believe, basically saying, hey, we stand with you. Our security cooperation is sound, but not so much that they would be willing to continue providing air support and contract maintenance and logistic support. and of course, Ghani fled a few hours later. We hear from the vice president in the Indo-Pacific, hey, we stand with you, allies and partners, and yet they won't even request a defense budget that keeps up with inflation. And they say, hey, Israel, we stand with you, but we're going to rejoin an Iran nuclear agreement that enriches the mullahs and helps their ballistic missile program and lacks basic inspection criteria. Right. So I don't impugn anyone's motives, but it's time to start matching deeds and words in this administration.
All right. Bradley Bowman of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or Mike Wagenheim, thank you for joining us.